The crystal champagne flute trembled in Eleanor Davenport's perfectly manicured hand, the soft golden light of the restaurant glinting off the diamond on her finger. Across the table, her son, Ethan, the heir to the Davenport billions, laughed at something his father said. It was a perfect picture of wealth, power, and familial bliss. But a single shadow was about to fall across this perfect canvas. A woman in a starched black waitress uniform, her face etched with a history of hardship, was walking towards their table, her steps heavy with the weight of a 22-year-old secret. She wasn't carrying a tray or a menu. She was carrying a truth so explosive it was about to shatter their world forever. What would you do if the life you knew was a lie, and the truth was standing right in front of you, wearing an apron? Clara Evans hated nights like this. The big spenders, the ones who ordered the $500 bottle of Chateau Margaux without glancing at the price and treated the staff like pieces of furniture that occasionally brought them bread. Tonight, the corner booth, the best in the house at Manhattan's exclusive restaurant, Aurelia, was occupied by the Davenports. Even if you didn't follow the society pages, you knew the Davenports. Richard Davenport, a man whose tailored suit was worth more than Clara's car, presided over a global shipping empire. His wife, Eleanor, was the city's reigning queen of philanthropy, a woman whose smile was as polished and impenetrable as the pearls at her throat. And between them was their son, Ethan. Clara had first seen him a month ago. It was a casual Tuesday, and he'd come in with friends. From across the bustling dining room, her breath had caught in her throat. It was a strange, primal jolt, a physical reaction she couldn't explain. He had his father's dark hair, but the shape of his eyes, the slight curve of his lips when he smiled, the way he tilted his head when he listened. It was like looking at a ghost. It was like looking at a younger, masculine version of herself. She had dismissed it. A foolish coincidence. She was 43, a career waitress with tired feet and a lifetime of regrets packed into a small, lonely apartment. What connection could she possibly have to a boy born with a silver spoon so large it could have served the whole restaurant? But then he came back. And again, tonight was his 22nd birthday celebration. Clara wasn't assigned to their table. That honor went to the senior staff. But she couldn't stop her eyes from straying. She watched as Eleanor Davenport smoothed a non-existent crease on Ethan's lapel, her touch possessive, her love for him a brilliant, fierce thing that radiated from her like heat. Clara felt a hollow ache in her chest, a phantom limb of a feeling she had buried decades ago. The memory, the one she kept locked away in the darkest vault of her mind, began to creak open. A cold, sterile hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, the crushing weight of shame and fear. She had been 21, a scholarship student at NYU, head over heels in love with a charming, handsome boy from a different world, a boy named Richard Davenport. It was a whirlwind romance, as intoxicating as it was doomed. She was a girl from a working-class family in Queens. He was the heir apparent. His family, particularly his formidable father, had never approved. When she found out she was pregnant, Richard had been terrified. He'd promised he'd figure it out, that they'd be a family. But his promises were as weak as his will. He was a puppet, and his family pulled the strings. The arrangement was made. She was sent to a discreet private clinic, St. Jude's Private Maternity Care, upstate. The Davenports would handle everything. The day she gave birth, a storm had been raging outside, mirroring the one in her heart. She held her baby boy for only a moment, long enough to see a shock of dark hair and his tiny, perfect fingers, before he was whisked away. A few hours later, a grim-faced doctor and a lawyer representing the Davenport family had delivered the news. Complications. He didn't make it. He was gone. They gave her a check, a sum so large it felt like blood money, and a non-disclosure agreement that bound her to silence forever. Richard wasn't there. He sent a letter, filled with apologies and a grief that felt performative even on paper. Overwhelmed, heartbroken, and utterly alone, Clara signed the papers and stumbled back into a life that had been permanently fractured. The money ran out years ago, spent on her own mother's medical bills. The grief never did. Now watching the boy, the man at that table, the lie she had been fed began to crumble. Complications. What if the complication was simply that he had been born healthy? What if the complication was her the unsuitable mother. "Clara! Table 7 needs their check," her manager, Mr. Dubois, hissed, snapping her out of her trance. She nodded, her movements automatic, but her mind was racing. The resemblance was too strong. The age was exactly right. He was born in late August, 22 years ago. The dates, the face, the father sitting right next to him. It was all coalescing into a truth so monstrous and undeniable that it made her feel dizzy. She watched as Eleanor raised her glass for a toast. "To my son, Ethan," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the quiet hum of the restaurant. "My greatest joy, the light of my life. From the moment I first held you, I knew my life was complete." Clara felt the words like a physical blow. A cold fury, an emotion she hadn't felt in years, began to smolder in the pit of her stomach. The moment I first held you, that was her moment. That was her memory. Stolen. She looked at Ethan, who was smiling at Eleanor, his eyes filled with genuine love and affection for the woman he believed was his mother. He looked happy. He had a life she could never have given him. For a moment she thought she should just walk away, leave it alone, let the ghost rest. But then Ethan looked up, his gaze sweeping the room, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes met hers. There was no recognition, of course. He just saw a waitress staring. He gave a small, polite, almost apologetic smile before turning back to his family. And in that fleeting, insignificant glance, Clara saw everything she had lost. It wasn't about the money or the lifestyle. It was about that smile. It was about the 22 years of smiles she had missed. The first steps, the first words, the scraped knees, the birthday parties. Everything had been stolen from her, built on a foundation of a single, colossal lie. The fury burned away the fear. The years of quiet sorrow sharpened into a single, pointed purpose. She looked at the Davenports, laughing in their gilded cage, and knew she couldn't serve another drink or clear another plate while her son sat feet away, living a lie. The ghost wouldn't be ignored anymore. It was time for a haunting. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and obsessive days. Clara's life, once a predictable rhythm of work and solitude, became a frantic, desperate quest for proof. She knew what she had seen, what her gut was screaming at her, but a mother's intuition wouldn't stand up to the Davenport legal team. She needed something concrete, something irrefutable. She started with what little she had. In a dusty shoebox at the back of her closet, buried beneath old photos and utility bills, was the small file of papers from her time at St. Jude's. The admission forms, the discharge summary that coldly stated postpartum recovery, infant deceased, and the NDA. The check was long gone, but the carbon copy of the settlement agreement was there. The signature of the Davenport family lawyer, a bold, arrogant scrawl. Her first call was to St. Jude's. The clinic, she discovered, had closed down over a decade ago, sold to a larger healthcare conglomerate. Its records were either destroyed or buried deep within a corporate archive, inaccessible to a prying waitress. A dead end. Frustration gnawed at her. She felt powerless, a tiny dinghy trying to make waves against a fleet of battleships. The Davenports had insulated themselves perfectly. They had money, influence, and 2 decades to bury their secret. Clara called in sick to work, something she hadn't done in years, and took a bus upstate to the town where the clinic had been. The building was now a luxury spa. There was no trace of its past, no echo of the cries of newborns or the silent tears of a heartbroken young mother. She walked the manicured grounds, trying to connect with the ghost of her 21-year-old self, hoping for a clue, a sign. Nothing. Defeated, she returned to her apartment. As she was putting the shoebox away, a corner of a faded envelope, tucked into a side pocket of the file, caught her eye. She didn't remember it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it out. It was a letter from Richard. The postmark was dated a week after the birth. She had never seen it before. It must have arrived while she was still in a fog of grief, and she'd packed it away without ever opening it. With a deep breath, she tore it open. The handwriting was shaky, hesitant. "My dearest Clara, there are no words to express my sorrow. I know this is a poor substitute for being there, but my father and Eleanor, they are watching my every move. They say it is for the best, to make a clean break. I feel like a coward, and I am. What happened at the hospital was a tragedy beyond imagining. Our son, our beautiful boy. I only saw him for a moment. He looked so perfect. I know the money they gave you feels insulting. It is. No amount of money can replace what we lost. I wanted to tell you that I will never forget him. Or you. You are the only person I have ever truly loved. They are forcing me to move on, to put this behind us, but I don't think I ever can. Forgive me. Yours, Richard. Clara read it once, then twice, then a third time, the words blurring through her tears. It was the letter of a grieving father. It seemed to confirm the story. Despair washed over her. Was she wrong? Was this all just a fantasy born of grief and a chance resemblance? Was she the crazy woman Eleanor Davenport would undoubtedly paint her to be? She was about to throw the letter down when a single sentence snagged her attention. I only saw him for a moment. He looked so perfect. It was a strange choice of words. Why not he looked so peaceful? Or just, I will miss him. He looked so perfect. The phrase echoed in her mind. It wasn't what you said about a baby who had just died from complications. It's what you said about a healthy newborn. It was thin, a thread, but it was enough. She needed help. She thought of Maria, her best friend from her brief time at NYU. They hadn't spoken in years, their lives having diverged so completely, but Maria had gone on to become a paralegal, working for a small but tenacious firm that specialized in family law. Finding her on social media was easy. Making the call was hard. Clara Evans, my God, is that really you? Maria's voice was warm, unchanged by the years. Clara explained everything, her voice cracking as she recounted the story she had told no one. She expected skepticism, pity, perhaps a gentle suggestion that she seek counseling. Instead, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. St. Jude's, Maria said, a new edge to her voice. Clara, that place had a reputation. It was where the wealthy and powerful went to make problems disappear. Adoptions, surrogacies, things they wanted kept off the official books. It was run by a Dr. Alistair Finch. He was notoriously discreet and notoriously expensive. A sliver of hope cut through Clara's despair. Could you find anything? On him? On the clinic? It's a long shot, Maria warned, but let me see what I can dig up. Don't do anything rash, Clara. These people, the Davenports, they play for keeps. You need armor before you go to war. For the next week, Clara felt like she was holding her breath. She went back to work, moving through the motions like an automaton, her mind elsewhere. Every time she saw a news report about the Davenports, her stomach clenched. Then, Maria called back. Her voice was low, urgent. I found something, she said. Dr. Finch retired a few years after the clinic closed. He's old now, living in a nursing home in Vermont. But that's not the interesting part. I managed to access a list of shell corporations the Davenports used for private expenses back in the 90s. Standard rich people stuff. But one of them made a series of large payments starting the month your son was born to another shell corporation. And I traced that second corporation back to one person. Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs. Who? A nurse, Maria said. A private maternity nurse named Amelia Croft. The payments continued, monthly, for 18 years. They stopped the month Ethan Davenport would have turned 18. The implication was staggering. You don't pay a private nurse for 18 years for a baby who died at birth. You pay her for silence. You pay her to help raise a child whose existence needs to be carefully managed. Clara, Maria said, her voice soft but firm, they didn't just take your son. It looks like they raised him in secret for a while, away from the public eye, before introducing him as Eleanor's. They probably faked a pregnancy for her. This wasn't just a snap decision. This was a conspiracy. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place. It was more calculated, more cruel than she had ever imagined. They hadn't just lied. They had constructed an entire false reality. I need proof that connects him to me, Clara whispered, her mind racing. A birth certificate. The official one will be forged, listing Eleanor as the mother, Maria said, but the clinic would have had to file an original record, a preliminary one. Finch was crooked, but he wasn't stupid. He'd have kept the original for his own protection, as leverage. The question is, where is it now? Clara knew she couldn't wait any longer. She didn't have the resources to track down Dr. Finch or find a 22-year-old piece of paper he might have hidden. She had Richard's letter, the information from Maria, and the absolute certainty in her own heart. The armor wasn't perfect, but it was all she had, and she was done waiting. Ethan's birthday party at Aurelia had been the spark. Now she had the fuel. She knew the Davenports were regulars. They came in every Friday. This Friday, she wouldn't be hiding in the kitchen. She would be waiting for them. Friday evening descended on Aurelia with its usual air of curated chaos. The clinking of glasses, the low murmur of moneyed conversations, the scent of truffle oil and ambition. Clara moved through it all in a daze, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every time the door opened, she flinched, expecting to see them. Mr. Dubois shot her several sharp looks, noticing her distraction, but she ignored him. At 8:15 they arrived, Richard looking weary and distracted. Eleanor, a vision in a sapphire blue dress, scanning the room with the practiced eye of a monarch surveying her court, and Ethan trailing slightly behind them, looking down at his phone with a small smile on his face. They were seated at their usual table. Clara's station was on the other side of the room, but it didn't matter. She felt the gravitational pull of their presence, an invisible string tying her to that corner booth. She watched as their waiter, Jean-Pierre, approached them, as they ordered their drinks, as Eleanor placed a perfectly manicured hand on Ethan's arm, laughing at something he said. Every laugh, every casual gesture of affection was a dagger in Clara's heart. She picked up a water pitcher, her hands so unsteady that water sloshed onto the tray. "Evans, get it together," Mr. Dubois muttered as he passed. She knew it was now or never. If she hesitated, the fear would win. The decades of silence would reclaim her. She had to do it before she could think, before she could second-guess the righteous fury that was propelling her forward. She set the pitcher down on a service stand, wiped her sweating palms on her apron, and began to walk. The 20 yards across the dining room felt like a mile. The plush carpet seemed to suck at her sensible black shoes. The faces of the diners blurred into a watercolor wash. Her entire world narrowed to the 4 people in that booth, illuminated under the soft glow of a low-hanging chandelier. She reached the table just as Jean-Pierre was setting down their drinks. He gave her a questioning look. She ignored him. Richard looked up first, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the interruption. Then his eyes met hers and the annoyance froze, replaced by a dawning, horrified recognition. His face went pale, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. He knew who she was. Eleanor followed his gaze, her expression shifting from curiosity to icy disdain. "Can we help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. It was the voice one used for a particularly slow or impertinent servant. Clara's eyes weren't on Eleanor. They were locked on Ethan. He looked up from his phone, a polite, questioning look on his handsome face. He had her eyes. Dear God, he had her eyes. "Ethan," she said, and the sound of his name on her lips, a name she had only ever whispered to herself in the dark, felt both foreign and profoundly right. Her voice was trembling, but it was clear. Ethan frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The moment was here. The world seemed to slow down. The clatter of the restaurant faded to a dull hum. It was just them. "My name is Claire Evans," she said, her voice growing stronger, fueled by adrenaline and 22 years of stolen time. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes, willing him to see, to feel the truth of her words. "I was a student at NYU. I knew your father." Richard made a small, choking sound. Eleanor's back went ramrod straight. "That is quite enough," she snapped, her voice low and dangerous. "Security." But Clara didn't stop. She couldn't. "We were in love," she continued, her gaze unwavering on Ethan. "And I got pregnant. On August 28th, 22 years ago, I gave birth to a baby boy at St. Jude's Clinic upstate. My baby." Ethan's polite confusion was curdling into shock. He glanced at his father, who was staring at his water glass as if it held the answers to the universe. He looked at his mother, whose face had become a mask of cold, controlled rage. "They told me he died." Clara's voice broke, but she pushed on, the words tumbling out. "They lied to me. They took him. They took you. She took one last, trembling step forward, her hand outstretched, not to touch him, but as a plea. Ethan, she whispered, the sound raw with a lifetime of pain. I'm your mother. I'm your real mother. Silence. A thick, profound silence fell over the table, more shocking than any shout. For a heartbeat, the world stopped turning. Then chaos erupted. Eleanor was the first to move. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Get away from my son, she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. Security! Get this lunatic out of here! Ethan was staring at Clara, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. Mom? What is she talking about? Dad? Richard wouldn't look at him. He wouldn't look at anyone. He just sat there, a statue carved from guilt. Two burly security guards were suddenly at Clara's side, their hands gripping her arms. But she didn't struggle. Her work was done. The bomb had been detonated. She kept her eyes on Ethan, trying to communicate everything she couldn't say. The love, the sorrow, the truth, in one last, desperate look. It's a lie, Ethan, Eleanor was saying, her voice high and frantic as she tried to pull his attention back to her. She's a sick, disturbed woman looking for money. That's all this is, a disgusting shakedown. But Ethan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his father's ashen face. He was looking at the raw, undeniable agony in Clara's eyes as the guards began to pull her away. He saw the way his father flinched when Clara's gaze passed over him. He saw the panic in his mother's eyes, a panic that went far beyond mere indignation. Wait, Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. The guards paused. Everyone looked at him. He looked from Clara's tear-streaked face back to Eleanor's furious one. Is it a lie? He asked, his voice laced with a terrible, newfound doubt. Mother, is it? The question hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Eleanor opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, the perfect, plausible lie wouldn't come. In her hesitation, in her flicker of sheer terror, Ethan found his answer. And as Clara was escorted out of the restaurant, past the stunned faces of the patrons and staff, she heard the sound of the Davenport family's perfect world beginning to tear apart at the seams. The aftermath of the scene at Aurelia was swift and brutal. For Clara, it meant immediate termination. Mr. Dubois, his face a mixture of pity and professional necessity, had her collect her things from her locker while the security guards watched, as if she might try to steal the silverware. Walking out of the service entrance and into the cool night air, she felt strangely calm. She had lost her job, but she had reclaimed her voice. For the Davenports, the night ended in a flurry of hushed apologies, a hastily paid bill, and a silent, terrifying limousine ride back to their penthouse on Park Avenue. The moment the heavy apartment door closed behind them, the fortress of their family life, once so impenetrable, revealed its cracks. How could you let this happen? Eleanor hissed at Richard, her voice a venomous whisper as she paced the marble floor of the foyer. 22 years of careful planning, of absolute discretion, undone by a common waitress in the middle of dinner. What did you want me to do, Eleanor? Richard finally found his voice, though it was weak and reedy. Tackle her? You could have denied it. You could have looked your son in the eye and lied. She shot back, rounding on him. My God, Richard, it's the one thing you've been good at all these years. Ethan stood by the window, his back to them, staring out at the glittering, indifferent skyline of the city. He felt numb, as if he were floating outside his own body, watching a scene from a particularly cruel play. The woman's face, her tear-filled eyes, her desperate, trembling voice saying, I'm your real mother. It played on a loop in his mind. He turned around. Is it true? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Eleanor rushed to his side, her entire demeanor changing in an instant. The vicious anger was gone, replaced by a suffocating, maternal concern. She reached for his arm, but he flinched away from her touch. A small, almost imperceptible movement that struck her harder than any physical blow. Ethan, darling, of course it's not true, she said, her voice smooth as silk. That woman is a classic grifter. She probably read about your birthday in the society columns, did a little research, and cooked up this insane story to extort money from us. It's a sad, pathetic tactic, but it happens to families like ours. She knew your name, Dad, Ethan said, his eyes fixed on Richard. She knew about NYU. She knew the name of the clinic. Richard shifted on his feet, avoiding Ethan's gaze. It's not hard to find information, son. The internet. And your face, Ethan cut him off, his voice hardening. I saw your face when she walked up to the table. You looked like you'd seen a ghost. I was shocked, Richard blustered, his defensiveness only highlighting his guilt. To have our family meal interrupted by some crazy person spouting nonsense. Listen to me, Ethan, Eleanor said, her tone urgent and pleading. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I went through 16 hours of labor to bring you into this world. I remember the first time you kicked. I remember the feel of you in my arms, seconds after you were born. Are you going to believe me, your mother who has loved you and raised you every single day of your life? Or some delusional stranger off the street? She was a masterful liar. Her performance was flawless, filled with specific, heartfelt details that should have been reassuring. But for the first time, Ethan felt their artificiality. He'd always had a vague sense of disconnect, a feeling of being slightly out of step with his own history. He had no baby photos, for instance. Eleanor had explained it away with a plausible story about a fire at their country home when he was a toddler that had destroyed all their early albums. He'd never had a reason to doubt it before. Now, every one of those small, odd inconsistencies rushed to the forefront of his mind. The next morning, the Davenport machine was in full swing. Their head of legal, a shark named Marcus Thorne, arrived at the penthouse for a breakfast meeting. Clara Evans was to be dealt with. A team of private investigators was already digging into her life, searching for any dirt, an old debt, a disgruntled ex-boyfriend, anything that could be used to paint her as unstable and untrustworthy. We'll file for a restraining order this afternoon, Marcus said, sipping his espresso. And we'll leak a story to the Post. Deranged waitress stalks billionaire heir. We control the narrative. We define her as a gold-digging fantasist before she has a chance to say another word. Ethan listened to it all, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. This wasn't the action of a family dismissing a nuisance. This was a calculated, overwhelming show of force designed to crush someone. Eleanor, sensing his unease, sat beside him on the sofa. I know this is upsetting, darling, she cooed, but this is how we protect our family. We have to be strong. We have to present a united front. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the love in her eyes, and he knew it was real. Her love for him was the most consistent, powerful force in his life. But he also saw a flicker of something else deep within them. Fear. A desperate, terrified fear that he had never seen before. Later that day, Ethan found his father in the study, pouring himself a generous midday scotch. I need the truth, Ethan said, closing the heavy oak doors behind him. Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping. Ethan, your mother and I have told you the truth. No, Ethan said, his voice steely. She told me a story. You've barely said a word. I'm asking you, man to man, father to son, look me in the eye and tell me that woman is lying. Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on the vortex. He looked old, defeated. The weight of 22 years of deceit was pressing down on him, and he was cracking under the strain. He couldn't do it. He couldn't meet his son's eyes. It's complicated, he mumbled into his glass. And with those two words, Ethan's world tilted on its axis. Complicated was not a denial. It was a confession. The fortress Eleanor had so carefully built, the one she was now reinforcing with lawyers and public relations experts, had just been breached from the inside. And the person holding the door open was his own father. In the days that followed, the Davenport penthouse became a place of suffocating tension. Eleanor was a whirlwind of activity, constantly on the phone with Marcus Thorne or her publicist, crafting the perfect narrative of a family under siege. She insisted on maintaining a normal schedule, charity luncheons, gallery openings, projecting an image of unwavering unity and aristocratic boredom at the ludicrous claims of a nobody. Ethan played his part, a handsome prop by his mother's side. He smiled for the cameras, shook the right hands, and said nothing. But inside, he was a roiling sea of doubt and confusion. His father's non-denial had been a quiet explosion, and he was still reeling from the blast. He started digging. not with private investigators, but into the archives of his own life. He went looking for his birth certificate. He found it in a safe in his father's study, a crisp official document listing Richard and Eleanor Davenport as his parents. But something felt off. The hospital was listed as Lenox Hill, right here in the city. The woman, Clara, had been specific, St. Jude's upstate. He spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes of research. He found a single archived newspaper article about the closure of St. Jude's private maternity care, mentioning its reputation for discreet services for high net worth individuals. He found nothing on a Clara Evans that suggested a history of mental instability or extortion. She had a clean record, a string of long-held, low-paying jobs, and a life of quiet anonymity. She didn't fit the profile of a master manipulator. The official story from Eleanor was starting to feel like a bespoke suit that didn't quite fit. Perfect on the surface, but tight and uncomfortable in hidden places. One afternoon, feigning a headache to get out of a fundraiser, Ethan stayed home alone. He wandered the vast, silent apartment, feeling more like a stranger in his own home than ever before. He ended up in his father's study again. This time, he wasn't looking for documents. He was just looking. He ran his hands over the leather-bound books, the expensive trinkets, the silver-framed photographs. There were dozens of photos of him and Eleanor, him and his father, the three of them on yachts, on ski slopes, at black-tie galas, a perfect life, meticulously documented. But it all started when he was about 3 years old. There was nothing before that. The fire at the country home was the official explanation, but it had always felt thin. On a bottom shelf, behind a set of encyclopedias, was a collection of old photo albums that had survived the supposed fire. They were mostly Richard's university photos. Ethan idly flipped through the stiff, yellowing pages. Pictures of a young Richard in a rowing blazer, at parties, looking carefree and impossibly young. And then he saw her. It was a candid shot, taken at an outdoor party. Richard had his arm around a young woman. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her dark hair catching the light. She was beautiful. And even 22 years younger, he recognized her instantly. It was Clara. His breath hitched. He pulled the photo closer. There was an undeniable spark between them, an easy intimacy that was missing from every single photograph of his parents together. This was not a casual acquaintance. This was a woman Richard Davenport had loved. He felt a strange mix of anger and a painful, burgeoning empathy. This woman wasn't a random grifter. She was a part of his father's life, a part that had been ruthlessly excised. He put the album back, his hands shaking slightly. He needed to talk to his father, alone, away from the suffocating influence of Eleanor. That evening, he waited until Eleanor had left for a museum board dinner. He found Richard in the media room, nursing another scotch and staring blankly at a news channel. "I found a picture," Ethan said, his voice flat, "of you and her, in one of your old albums." Richard flinched and muted the television. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. "She wasn't just some random woman, was she?" Ethan pressed, walking closer. "You loved her." Richard didn't answer. He just stared at the blank screen, his face a mask of misery. "Why, Dad?" Ethan's voice cracked with an emotion he couldn't name. It was betrayal, but it was also a deep, aching sadness. "Why would you let them do it? Let her do it?" He didn't need to say Eleanor's name. "If I am her son, your son, how could you just give me away? How could you let her believe I was dead?" Richard finally looked up, his eyes swimming with unshed tears and decades of regret. "You have to understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was young. I was weak. My father, he threatened to disinherit me. He said she would ruin my life, ruin the family name. And Eleanor, she couldn't have children. We had been trying for years. She was devastated." He took a shaky breath. "It was supposed to be a solution, a way to solve everyone's problems. Clara would be free to live her life, Eleanor would have the child she always wanted, and the Davenport line would have an heir. It seemed so logical, so clean in the way my father and Eleanor explained it." "You told a woman her child was dead," Ethan said, the words like stones in his mouth. "There is nothing logical or clean about that. It's monstrous." "I know," Richard whispered, finally breaking. A single tear traced a path through the weathered landscape of his face. "And I have lived with it every single day of my life. Every time I look at you, I see her, and I see the man I was too much of a coward to be." It was the confession Ethan had been searching for. The first real crack in the dam of lies. The truth was out, spoken between father and son in the dim light of the media room, and it was ugly and heartbreaking. Ethan felt a surge of white-hot anger at this weak, broken man in front of him. But beneath the anger was a sliver of pity. Richard was a prisoner in this gilded cage, just as much as he and Clara had been his victims. The true architect of their suffering, the true jailer, was his mother, the woman he had loved and trusted above all others. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Richard alone with his scotch and his ghosts. He knew what he had to do next. The confrontation with his father was just the beginning. The real reckoning was yet to come. Ethan felt a cold, unnerving clarity settle over him. The anger, the confusion, the grief. It was all still there, but it had coalesced into a single, hard point of purpose. He needed to find Clara. He needed to hear the story from her, without the filter of his family's lies and manipulations. He didn't know where she lived, but he remembered the name of the restaurant. A quick search led him to a staff member's social media page, which mentioned a farewell drink for Clara. From there, he found her profile. It was mostly private, but her profile picture was a simple, unsmiling photo. He saw the same strength and sorrow in her eyes that he'd seen at the restaurant. He sent her a message. It was short, direct. "My name is Ethan Davenport. I believe you. Can we please talk?" He didn't expect a reply, but one came within the hour. "There's a small park on 78th and the river. Benches by the water. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., come alone." That night, sleep was impossible. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his lavish bedroom. A room that now felt like a stage set for a life that wasn't his. He thought about Eleanor, sleeping in the master suite down the hall. He replayed 22 years of memories in his head, searching for the truth beneath the fiction. He saw her fierce love, her unwavering support, her constant presence. How could a love so seemingly genuine be built on such a monstrous deception? Was the love itself a lie, or was it the only true thing in the entire sordid mess? The next morning, he slipped out of the apartment before anyone was awake. The park was quiet, a cool autumn breeze rustling the last of the leaves on the trees. He saw her sitting on a bench facing the East River, a small, solitary figure wrapped in a worn coat. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled with everything that had been unsaid for 22 years. "Thank you for meeting me," he said finally, his voice hoarse. She just nodded, her eyes scanning his face, as if she were trying to memorize every line, every feature she had been denied. "My father," Ethan began, He told me everything." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of emotion passing over her face. It wasn't triumph, but a deep, shuddering relief. "So you know," she whispered, "I'm not crazy." "No," he said, his voice thick. "You're not." And then he asked her to tell him her story, from the beginning. She spoke for over an hour, her voice quiet and steady. She told him about meeting Richard, about their whirlwind romance, about her hopes and her fears. She described the sterile room at St. Jude's, the brief moment she held him, the crushing weight of the lie they told her. She spoke without melodrama or self-pity, a simple, devastating recitation of the facts. He listened, and for the first time, he felt the true gravity of what had been done. This wasn't an abstract family secret anymore. It was the stolen life of the woman sitting next to him, a life of grief, of struggle, of wondering what had happened to the baby she thought was dead. "Why now?" he asked gently. "After all this time, what made you come forward?" "I saw you," she said simply, looking at him. "I was pouring wine at another table, and I looked up and I saw you laughing with your friends. And it was like a key turning in a lock I had forgotten was even there. I knew. I just knew. And once I knew you were alive, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't go back to pretending." He saw the truth of it in her tired, honest eyes. This wasn't about money. It was about a primal, undeniable connection that had been severed by deceit. When she finished, he didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt laughably inadequate. He was the beneficiary of her pain, the living symbol of her loss. "I don't know what happens now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore." "You're still you," Clara said, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "You just know the whole story now." He left the park feeling like the world had been remade. The city looked different. The people looked different. The very air he was breathing felt different. He knew there was one final confrontation he had to face. He walked back to the penthouse. It was late afternoon. He found Eleanor in the living room, arranging a bouquet of lilies in a crystal vase. She smiled when she saw him, a bright, brittle smile. "There you are, darling. I was getting worried. Where have you been?" "I was meeting my mother," Ethan said, his voice devoid of emotion. Eleanor froze, a white lily clutched in her hand. The smile vanished. "Don't be ridiculous, Ethan. We've been over this. That woman—" "I met with Clara Evans," he interrupted, his voice cold and hard. "And before that, I spoke with Dad. He confessed, Eleanor. He told me everything. The affair, the clinic, the lie about the stillbirth, your plan." Every word was a hammer blow, chipping away at her composure. Her face, a carefully maintained mask of beauty and control, began to crumble. "He's a weak, sentimental fool," she hissed, her eyes flashing with fury. "He was never strong enough. I did what had to be done. For this family, for you." "For me?" Ethan let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You stole me. You built my entire life on the suffering of another woman. You let her believe her child was dead for 22 years. What kind of love is that?" "A mother's love," she cried, her voice rising, cracking with a desperation he had never heard before. "The love that does what is necessary. I couldn't have a child of my own. Richard had created this situation. I took a disaster and I turned it into a miracle. I gave you a life that she could never have dreamed of, a world of opportunity, of privilege, of safety. I gave you everything. You gave me a lie," he roared, the full force of his betrayal finally erupting. "Everything. My name, my history, my very identity is a lie you constructed. Did you ever stop to think about her? The woman whose heart you broke? Or did she just cease to exist for you once you had what you wanted?" The truth of his words finally seemed to breach her defenses. The anger drained away, replaced by a raw, naked agony. The crystal vase slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor, the lilies and water spilling like a tragic offering. "I love you, Ethan," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "That was never a lie. From the moment they placed you in my arms, you were my son. You are my son. Please, please don't hate me." He looked at the woman who had raised him, the woman he had called mother his entire life, now a sobbing, broken figure amidst the wreckage of her lies. He didn't feel hate. Hate was a hot, passionate emotion. What he felt was a vast, cold emptiness. The bond between them, once the bedrock of his existence, had been pulverized into dust. "I don't know what I feel," he said, his voice hollow. "But the woman you were yesterday, the mother I loved, she doesn't exist anymore. You made sure of that." He turned his back on her, on the shattered vase, on the ruins of their life together, and walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor Davenport utterly and finally alone. In the weeks that followed, the Davenport empire, which had seemed so invincible, began to publicly fracture. The story, no longer controllable by Eleanor's PR team, exploded into the mainstream media. It was a scandal of epic proportions, a modern-day Greek tragedy played out in the headlines of tabloids and broadsheets alike. The narrative had been ripped from Eleanor's control. Clara Evans was no longer a deranged waitress, but the mother who was robbed. Ethan moved out of the penthouse and into a modest apartment downtown, distancing himself from the name and the wealth that now felt tainted. He officially put his position at his father's company on indefinite hold. He needed space, Time to process the seismic shift in his reality. Richard and Eleanor's marriage, a business arrangement held together by secrets and social obligations for years, finally imploded. Richard moved to the family's country home, a broken man seeking refuge in solitude. Eleanor remained in the penthouse, a queen in a castle with no subjects, ostracized by the same high society she had once ruled. Her friends, whose loyalty was transactional, abandoned her at the first whiff of scandal. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her invitations were declined. Her punishment was not prison, but a far crueler sentence for a woman like her: irrelevance. Ethan's new life was quiet, uncertain. He and Clara began to meet regularly. It was awkward, tentative. They were strangers, bound by blood but separated by a lifetime of different experiences. They didn't try to force a relationship that wasn't there. There were no tearful reunions or grand pronouncements of a ready-made family. Instead, they took walks. They sat in diners, drinking coffee, and talked. He told her about his childhood, about his passion for architecture, a dream he'd put aside to join the family business. She told him about her mother, about the friends she'd lost and kept, about the quiet, simple life she had led. They were discovering each other, piece by piece. He saw in her a resilience he had never known, a quiet dignity forged in hardship. She saw in him a kindness and an integrity that hadn't been spoiled by wealth, a glimpse of the boy she had lost. One crisp November afternoon, they were sitting on their usual bench in the park. "I found some of your old things," Clara said, pulling a small, worn photo from her purse. "From when I was pregnant. I was so sure you were going to be a girl. I bought this stupid pink hat." She handed him the photo. It was a sonogram, a grainy black and white image of a tiny, indistinct shape. His first picture, a picture he had never known existed. He stared at it, a lump forming in his throat. This was real. This was a piece of his history that hadn't been fabricated. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I don't know how to be the son you lost." Clara reached out and for the first time placed her hand over his. Her hand was worn from years of work, but it was warm. "You don't have to be," she said, her voice soft. "You just have to be the son I found. We can figure out the rest together. We have time." He looked at her, at this woman who was both a stranger and the very origin of his life, and he felt a flicker of something new. It wasn't the comfortable, familiar love he'd had for Eleanor. It was something more fragile, more complex, but infinitely more real. It was hope. The path forward was unclear. The wounds were deep and would take years to heal, if they ever did fully. Reconciling his love for the woman who raised him with the devastating truth of her actions felt impossible. Forgiving the weakness of his father was a journey he had yet to begin. But as he sat there, with the sonogram photo in one hand and his birth mother's hand covering his other, Ethan felt that for the first time in his life, he was no longer living a lie. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was the terrifying, uncertain, and beautiful freedom of the truth. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a beginning, a real one. This story is a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds a way to the surface. It explores the complexities of motherhood, the devastating impact of secrets, and the painful but necessary journey of forgiveness and self-discovery. We see that love, even when it is fierce and genuine, can be twisted into something possessive and destructive when it's built on a foundation of lies. The lives of Clara, Ethan, Eleanor, and Richard were forever changed by one woman's courage to speak her truth in a quiet restaurant. It leaves us with a question. Can a lie built on love ever truly be forgiven? And what does it take to rebuild a life and a family from the ashes of deceit? If this story of heartbreak, betrayal, and the enduring power of a mother's love moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and subscribing to the channel for more content that explores the deepest corners of the human heart. Let us know in the comments below. What do you think Ethan should do next? We'd love to hear your thoughts.